I am here with Mathieu Gorge from VigiTrust. And why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself first, and then we can get into our discussion.
Thank you, Hugh, and thanks for the opportunity to talk to you today. So my name is Mathieu. I'm the founder and CEO of VigiTrust, which is a company based in Dublin, in Ireland, with offices in New York and Paris. We're a company that specializes in software as a service, governance, risk compliance tools. So what that means in practice is we help our clients and partners prepare for, validate, and manage continuous compliance with about 100 plus security frameworks, regulations, and standards worldwide. And so I've developed over the last maybe 24, 25 years that I've been in cybersecurity, a great passion for security and compliance and the evolution of risks, generally speaking. I suppose my starting point is I look at the risk ecosystem that we're faced with as a community, as a country, as a community of countries sometimes. And I often talk about what I call the bubbles of risks. And I see four major bubbles of risks. One, which is geopolitical risk. Another one, which is financial and contractual risk. The third one, which is all about reputation and brand. And the fourth one, which is really about technical risk from an ICT and an IT perspective. So from a geopolitical risk, I think that's where all of the public policy changes matter and where we talk about national security. And I'll give you 3 or 4 examples of stuff that happened in 2021 that impacted that. So you had the Biden administration coming in with a new agenda, coming in with the executive order, coming in with the will to try and put in a federal mandate on privacy, which, by the way, wasn't new. Other administrations tried to do that before. And you saw the evolution with obviously CCPA being implemented, but also with Virginia and other states trying to do their own stuff. You saw the impact of Brexit in Europe on data protection and data transfer. And then we also saw the impact of what was happening in Afghanistan with regards to cybersecurity, generally speaking. And then finally, at the end of the year, in November, one of the major changes was the new regulation around data privacy in China. Now, there was changes all throughout the world, and there was a good number of changes in Africa as well. And I'd be quite happy to talk about that if that's of interest.
Well, let's talk about China. What happened in China that is significant?
Yeah, so China published a new regulation around data privacy, and it was in the making for a while, and it finally came into action in November. And it's essentially looking at putting in place a framework similar to, with some similarities to GDPR and to CCPA, but with a Chinese twist on it. And so it's all looking at the privacy and the trust and the digitization of data in China. And so one simplistic way of looking at it is this is the Chinese answer to GDPR. The reality is that whilst there are commonalities with GDPR and indeed with CCPA, there are also some differences as to how they define data, how they define transfer of data, the life cycle of the data, but also what they're going to do if something goes wrong. And that part is not clear yet. I mean, looking at what's happening in China, you might be thinking that perhaps they're going to be tougher than Europe or the US, but that hasn't been seen just yet. So we're waiting to see what happens in 2022 in terms of implementation, sanctions. What we do know is that the plan is that the sanctions would be not just monetary, but also criminal sanctions, which would be slightly different than what we have. Again, however, this is not in place just yet. So I think that's interesting. The next step, obviously, and if you look at the history of data protection and privacy in Europe and in the US, in Australia, in other countries, you'll find that once the data privacy framework is put in place, there's an update to data breach notification that follows, and there's also an update to data transfer. So the idea of transferring data in and out of China is touched on by the new regulation, but there's no specific independent framework for that just yet. But my hunch is that within a few years we will see that happening. And so for any company that is importing stuff from China or exporting to China or exchanging data with China, it's important to get trained. Of course, we've seen a lot of newly appointed Chinese data security experts out there on the internet. And the advice would be to be wary of that. But you can be sure that all of the big legal firms are producing white papers and benchmarking at the moment, and some of them are actually quite useful. It all comes down to how it's going to be implemented from a government perspective.
So so what does that mean? Yeah, let's try to walk through like an example. So let's say you're a big multinational corporation and you have operations in China. What is the first step? You have to devise new policies, right? And then what?
So I think the first step is before you devise the new policies is to get educated on the actual controls that are required. Like any data privacy framework, it is based on, as you said, policies and procedures around the data. It's based on putting in place technical controls and technical configurations. It's also based on mandatory training. And the whole idea is being able to demonstrate that you follow the rules. So that itself is not really new. The way the data is classified and the way the data is looked at from a Chinese government perspective can be sometimes slightly different. So my advice would be to engage with your legal partners to do that. And in fact, we've seen we have some legal partners in China and some in the US and some in Europe, and we see them collaborating to see how they can actually start educating people. This is really early days. So I'm afraid I can't give you a silver bullet. I'm not even sure there will be a silver bullet for that. But one thing is for sure, whether you look at CCPA, GDPR, or the Chinese regulation, you are guaranteed to have an impact at policy level, defining how you create the data or how you acquire the data and the life cycle of the data from a security and governance perspective. So that needs to be regulated by a workflow, a framework of policies and procedures that need to be communicated to the end users within your organization. There's going to be a requirement for technical controls, the usual suspects, the firewalls, the intrusion detection, the encryption, two-factor authentication by default, that kind of stuff, and then the skills transfer. The best advice we can give at this point in time, owing to lack of implementation, is that you need to look at it as a best practice. If you were to start in any country, whether it's China or another country, you would be well advised to map out your ecosystem from a data perspective. So all of the different silos, where is the data created? Where is it saved? Is there a cloud implemented somewhere? And then you map out the data transfer between all of those different silos, and you try and put the right controls in place at every area where you have risk surface. And so the best way to do that is to go back to basics. Now, I have a vested interest in the methodology I'm going to mention, but I created about 12 years ago a methodology called the 5 Pillars of Security. And it's based on the idea that whether you look at the Chinese regulation, US privacy frameworks, GDPR, the equivalent in South Africa or wherever, you always dial back to 5 common denominators that allow you to then translate your controls into local regulations or frameworks. And those 5 areas are physical security, people security, data security, infrastructure security in the widest sense of it. So all of those silos I spoke about, your foreign subsidiaries, your remote working people, your hybrid workforce, your third parties, fourth parties, and then crisis management. And all of this applies to the Chinese regulation. So if you don't know where to start, what you can do is you can map out your current security posture as against those 5 pillars, and then drill down into the controls of any new regulation, including the Chinese one. And that gives you a benchmark in terms of maturity.
Right. So you wrote a book about this, right? This is, if I'm
I
right from.
did. I did. Yeah, I wrote a book called the Cyber Elephant in the Boardroom, and it's based on the requirement for the key decision makers to understand that there are cyber accountability mandates. The new Chinese regulation being one of them. So if you do business in China and you're not familiar with the local data privacy framework, you will have zero chance in the world of proving that you take cyber accountability seriously. The challenge right now is not so much, in my view, that there's new regulations. It's that the key decision makers might be either paying lip service to it or ignoring it or not understanding it. And so paying lip service to it is kind of brushing it off. I'll come back to it later. It's not ignoring it, but it's basically saying, I'm not going to deal with it right now. Ignoring it is plain crazy. I would not advise doing that in any country, but probably not China in any event. And the issue with not understanding it is that the security people and compliance people, we love 3-letter acronyms. We love to talk about what we know best, the controls, the technology, the data transfer, and so on. One thing that we need to do is we need to be the interpreters for the key decision makers. So as a CSO, as a CISO, it's my job to translate what the regulation wants in terms of technical stuff, policy, training, into business language. And so I have to translate the risk of not complying to what does that mean to the board? What does that mean to the organization, to its growth, to its future? And the way to do that is to go back to basics and remove the legal and technical jargon, if that makes sense.
Yes, I mean that is, I think, a really important point. That I think that if the board level or senior managers, even if they want to take this seriously, they have to be able to discuss it in terms that they understand. And I think that I think what you're saying is important. That if you can be translating these sort of 3-letter acronyms into concepts that the board can understand, then you're gonna hopefully make progress in addressing it. And I mean, do you have a sense if you don't have to comment on this if you don't want to, but is the Chinese regulation, is it based more about a concern about data breach or about privacy for individual people? Like if GDPR seems to be driven more by consumer privacy concerns, where is China more concerned about data getting out, about Chinese people being breached?
So I think it's too early to say. On the face of it, it's managing data and making sure that citizens and businesses are protected. So it does touch on data breach. The real reasoning behind it is hard to know. But again, if I go back to my 4 bubbles of risks and I look at the geopolitical risk, without that kind of regulation, China was taking a risk, right? Because the US is going CCPA, Virginia, New York, New Jersey, Washington, and so on. Europe has GDPR. There's a new privacy framework, recent privacy framework in Russia. There's a new one in South Africa. There's the NGPD, the Nigeria Data Protection Regulation. There's a new one in Ghana. Kenya is pushing another one. There's a huge push in North Africa for PCI and protection of payment data and so on. And China was not being seen as having its own per se. So I think that's also a geopolitical answer to what's happening in the industry. But to go back to one of your previous points about managing the risks, it's not a case that the board doesn't know how to deal with risk. I mean, the board deals with risk every day: financial risk, HR risk, growth risk, M&A risk. It's just that we're not bringing the cyber risk and the data privacy risk to them in terms that they can understand. And one way to deal with that is to talk to them in plain English, but also to say your data is an asset, right? So the data is the oil that's running the company engine. And so if we lose the data, we have a problem. So now let's try and put a value on that data. So traditionally, in the last 10 years, most organizations have put value on the data by looking at what is the impact of having a breach. Well, there are some very good studies out there, like the Cisco study or the Verizon data breach investigation report, that put a value per record that's actually being compromised. So you can multiply the number of records by that average value over several reports, and that gives you a median value, and that's the minimum value that's the minimum cost that you're going to have to count as an impact. What if you were to look at this the other way? Let's say that you say, okay, well, I'm gonna invest, I don't know, 50 grand in having somebody write good policies. I'm going to have to invest $250,000 in firewalls, IDS, IPS, whatever. I'm going to train people, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all of the software and all of the physical assets, and I'm going to put them on an asset list with an actual value, depreciation over 3 years. And suddenly I have those assets on my company accounts, on my balance sheet. So now that the assets are on the balance sheet, I guarantee you that when you go to the boardroom and you start talking about the value of the assets and the balance sheet of the company, they can't ignore cybersecurity, because it's now a line item or several line items on the accounts. And so, especially for a public company, they would have to disclose that. And suddenly you're kind of saying, okay, it would cost me 5 million or 10 million or 50 million to deal with a breach. But if I'm investing 20 million of assets and I depreciate them, suddenly my exposure is limited. And I can also demonstrate to the regulators or the enforcement bodies that I take cybersecurity seriously. And so our challenge as security people is to go to the board with that kind of language and that kind of approach, because they will get that really, really easily. They deal with risk every day.
Right, that makes sense. Well, good. Well, why don't we wrap up? I don't want to. This was really great. I appreciate your insights. I think people will find it very useful, especially because I think the China issue is new. It's really big for a lot of companies, and why don't we leave it at that? Okay.
That's great. And
okay.
Thanks again for the opportunity. And as you said, it's early days. My guess is that if we were to do this in 6 months' time, we could drill into the topic a good bit more.
Well, perhaps we should do a follow-up then. That would be interesting to see. But thank you for being with us today, okay?
Thank you very much.